Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jennifer Henry, a proud alum of the University of Melbourne and a member of the university's advancement team. I'm your MC for today. For thousands of generations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have shown respect for the lands, skies and waterways, maintaining meaningful and continuous connections with country and place. They are Australia's first socially and environmentally responsible citizens and uphold the importance of Indigenous land management and sustainability practices. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land from which we broadcast today, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which you, our viewers, are joining us. We pay our respects to the resilience and strength of their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Thank you for your interest in today's panel discussion. This is being conducted as a virtual event while Melbourne remains in lockdown due to COVID-19, with most of us working from home. 2020 has presented Australia with unparalleled challenges. 12.6 million hectares scorched by the bushfires, and a pandemic which has dramatically changed the way we live, work and socialise. Do the disasters we have faced and continue to endure provide us with an opportunity to reset, reevaluate and change the way we live to create a more sustainable world? Today, we bring together several of the university's experts, along with industry and government leaders, to discuss the connection between disaster and resilience through the lens of climate change. Before we continue, I'll introduce Zara, our graphic recorder, who will be doing a live sketch of the event. Zara will appear on your screen throughout this session so you can watch her illustration come to life. Welcome, Zara. Please note that this event is being recorded and the video of this webinar will feature on the university's Melbourne School of Engineering and Faculty of Science web pages. As part of today's discussion, our panel will be addressing some of the many questions put to us by you, our audience, during registration. We also encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. You'll find the Q&A icon on the panel at the bottom of your page, depending on your screen setup. To submit a question, simply open up the Q&A box and type in your questions. We will try and address as many questions as possible. And now some brief introductions, noting that full bios appear on the event webpage. I'm Dr. Jennifer Henry. I have an agricultural science degree and PhD from the University of Melbourne. My early career was spent in science communication with CSIRO Publishing, Nature Publishing Group and the New York Academy of Sciences. I joined the advancement team at the University of Melbourne in 2014 and, on a personal note, am passionate about sustainability being the core consideration in every decision we make. And I'm a strong believer in the role that universities can play in education, research and governance in sustainable development. Dr. Gillian Sparks is the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability in Victoria. She has extensive experience in the private and public sectors, including the Country Fire Authority, where she is currently a board member, and is Chair of Frontier SI. Through the Victorian State of the Environment report, Gillian is pioneering the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Welcome, Gillian.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Mark Crosweller has vast experience in crisis, national security and emergency management, leading major strategic reform in governance, strategy, policy, operations and capability. He is the founder and director of Ethical Intelligence and senior advisor to KPMG, advising on climate, disaster risk and leadership ethics. Welcome, Mark.
Morning, Jennifer.
Professor Abbas Rajabifard is Director of Sustainability in the Melbourne School of Engineering and Director of the Centre for Spatial Data Infrastructures and Land Administration. He's also chair of the UN Global Geospatial Information Management Academic Network, which enables member states to address sustainability development goals. Welcome, Abbas.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Pleasure.
And Associate Professor Michael Fletcher is a descendant of the Wiradjuri. He is Assistant Dean Indigenous in the Faculty of Science and a panel member of the Australian Research Council College of Experts. He is a geographer with interests in the long-term interactions between humans, climate, disturbance, vegetation and landscapes in the Southern Hemisphere, with a particular emphasis on how Indigenous burning has shaped the Australian landscape. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me.
On behalf of the Melbourne School of Engineering and the Faculty of Science, I welcome our panellists to today's discussion on disaster resilience and the future of sustainability. Thank you all for joining us today. This discussion will focus on how we can create a sustainable pathway out of 2020 and build resilience into the future. First, the bushfires and now a global pandemic. 2020 has presented unprecedented complexity of disaster. How can we support and build resilience in such trying times? Mark?
Thanks, Jennifer. I think the first thing is we have to come to accept as a society that we're not separate from nature. We have this view that we can conquer or that we can withstand or that we can ignore, really. And much of the institutional decisions, I think, historically, particularly in more of modern society, has been to ignore these forces. Michael will have much to say about this from an Indigenous perspective, but I think in terms of the built environment, we've ignored the hazard, the threat, the peril for too long, and on the basis of a false optimism or based on statistical probabilities of rarity. And of course, what actually happens is something quite different. So I think we do need to accept that we are part of the natural system and to accommodate the forces of nature, the will of nature, and the need of nature as part of living in society, not ignoring it. I think the second thing I'd say, Jennifer, is that, and particularly with COVID-19, but I think also the bushfire experience, it's been a global rupture of value. And I think our values have shifted or are shifting intrinsically, so what we hold as value internally and what we place as value externally. And those things are shifting for people, quite uncomfortably for many. There's immense suffering and difficulty along the way, but nonetheless that is happening. And we certainly saw it through the bushfire crisis of last summer, that what people held as value internally or externally was radically shifted or transformed as a result of a crisis experience. And we know this is quite a normal phenomena of humanity, that we have a variable set of values before adversity, and then of course they tend to become more universal afterwards or during and afterwards. So I think we need to gain a much greater appreciation of what it is that we deem to be important in the context of how we live in a system and cycle of nature. And the third thing I'd say, Jennifer, is that we've got to move from a hazard-based paradigm of risk to a reduction of vulnerability. And that's vulnerability of systems, of ecosystems, of humans. You cannot deal with bushfire risk in Australia by dealing with hazard alone. And certainly there's many things you can do in relation to hazard to moderate, to modify and to accommodate and to live with. But ultimately, I think what causes the greatest cause of suffering is our vulnerability to harm and our inability to adapt or to survive that harm or to navigate through it. And that's a much different set of propositions than just simply trying to manage the hazard all the time, which is where we end up often in natural hazard risk, is trying to deal with the hazard itself, not dealing with the real source of risk, which I think is the vulnerability of, as I said, systems, ecosystems, environment, and humanity.
Michael, what changes would you like to see in the next few years as we rebuild and reframe the way we manage the land?
Yeah, Mark makes some really good points. I think I'd like to see shared some notions that are really barriers to effectively managing or living in the world around us. I think the concept of nature has a utility, but it's born from a separation of humans from nature. You know, this sort of nature-culture divide that Mark impressed upon. We need to sort of debase ourselves of that myth, if you like, and take our responsibility and our obligations in a landscape, especially a landscape like Australia, which is effectively managed for millennia upon millennia, you know, at least 65,000 years of human involvement and cultural practice in shaping, managing, maintaining the landscape around us. And this kind of this us and them, this dualism that is present in modernity, modern society today, is causing a lot of the problems that we face. We're seeing rapid rates of extinction of animals. You know, we have the highest small mammal extinction rate on Earth, and one of the highest rates of biodiversity loss on Earth. We're seeing an increase in catastrophic fires because we're not managing the landscape. We're not fulfilling our obligations in a landscape. We need to stop this kind of combative attitude. You can see it really present in things like our approaches to bushfire. You know, we have a paramilitary operation around fighting and containing and battling fire, rather than fulfilling obligations in the landscape and the world around us every day, embracing, understanding and working with the world around us. We battle, contain, and then switch off once the danger's over and then face it again, rather than continually embedding ourselves in the world around us. And I think that's one of the things that we need to take a long, hard look at. It's just the way that we position ourselves in the world around us.
Let's move on to COVID-19. Abbas, do you see the current COVID-19 pandemic and experience changing how we develop sustainable infrastructures in the community? And if so, how?
Yes, thank you. I totally believe that this actually has already impacted us, and we are living in a new norm, and the current processes actually cannot be operated anymore. We have opportunity, in fact, here that we can redesign and adapt and to become more resilient. Otherwise, we cannot. And I think this pandemic has already demonstrated that the whole world is not in the resilience, status well. So therefore, we need to look at and come up with the arrangement and the redesigning our cities and also our societies in a way that we can better manage and become more resilient. I totally agree with what Mark has just indicated, and we are dealing with a complex system. So it is not just one lens that we need to deal with. We have to look at to the multifaceted actually case and have a holistic approach dealing with this and engaging. And in fact, we have also opportunity right now because the change is fresh now in everyone minds. So therefore, there is opportunity that we can work together and get the resilience actual status in a better form.
Thank you. Gillian, how can we harness the current interest in science and data related to COVID-19 epidemiology and encourage its use in climate change and environmental sustainability actions going forward?
Well, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to Mark, Michael and Abbas for their insightful contributions. My job as a commissioner actually is independent science reporting. So I've turned my mind to this a lot about how do we continue to ensure our science is used and useful for changing behaviours. And I think reflecting on how we've responded to the pandemic and how we respond to science in general, I do think people understand science for decision-making when there's an immediacy to the consequence. So I think that the behaviours that we see and observe during the pandemic are linked, of course, to the fact that once we talk about the science, we then immediately have an action to follow up. So there's a consequence. I understand, as on a personal level, I can understand it and I can take it forward. So the challenge for us then becomes to post-pandemic and as it relates to climate science is to try and get people to, or at least help people to understand and appreciate there is an immediacy to the issue around climate impact. There is a consequence, and it picks up what everyone else has said. The system is shifting and you're part of that system, so it will affect you. And so this is a really important and challenging thing to do, but I do think we need to continue to move from problem definition to what are we doing and how does it impact my life, because people respond to things that are usually impacting them more at a more granular level. Engaging the community with the biodiversity loss, I think, is a really important part of that. And I do think the pandemic also has helped us reconnect with nature, even if only because we've needed to, particularly in Melbourne, stay in our 5 kilometre radius and go for our walks and things like that. So I'm hoping that the discussions we'll have about biodiversity science and biodiversity loss will be more meaningful for people post-pandemic, because they relied so much on the natural environment to help with their well-being through the pandemic.
Interesting. On one hand, we've now seen what humanity can do when it chooses to treat a global threat seriously. But on the other hand, we'll be living in an economically damaged world in which many people will be struggling. So, Gillian, do you think society will be willing to take drastic measures to tackle global problems in the aftermath of this pandemic?
My personal view as an optimist is this is the moment that we have a real opportunity to rebuild our economy post-COVID. The fact that we've had such big economic impact of the pandemic is an opportunity to change the way we go forward. And in our work, we look to the Sustainable Development Goals to help us get a framework that defines the system, how we might go forward, so how we might calibrate and measure against an equitable framework that takes into account socioeconomic and as well as environmental issues to go forward as we grow the economy. So I actually think this is a moment in time where we have the biggest opportunity we've had for a long time, and I'm really optimistic, and I do feel that people are thinking differently. And picking up what Mark said, I think there's something about our values intrinsically shifting through the experiences we've collectively had.
It's exciting. Sticking with you, Gillian, one more question. How much future action on sustainability is going to be centralised, top-down and supply-side, versus community, decentralised and bottom-up?
Well, I'm a great believer that the system requires the top-down, bottom-up. It needs that balance between the both, and we've seen this with climate policy, for example. You must have your policy frameworks, your targets, and things like that to help gear the system in that way. But the bottom-up is fundamental. It's boots on the ground that are doing the work now. If we just turn our mind to biodiversity and even just in my patch in Victoria, how we look after Crown land, for example, we have hundreds of communities working as volunteers, looking after through committees of management, local trust, doing the field work, doing the citizen science work. If we didn't have those people doing that, we wouldn't have the management of Crown land and the understanding at that level. Equally, 67% of Victoria is private land. So we have a lot of people working in land care, on the ground, doing enormous amounts of work through their community. My view is the community will drive the politics, though, and the politics drives the policy. So in your work with the CFA, what have you seen to work well in terms of forward planning to provide an immediate response to bushfires? So, look, as you mentioned, Jennifer, I'm on the board of the CFA. It's a great privilege and an honour to be part of that huge community, again, of volunteers that are looking after their communities. And a critical aspect is town planning. So one of the things that I noticed, we went from Lakes Entrance to Buchan in February after the dreadful fires in East Gippsland, and listening to the CFA captain and other agency firefighters from Parks Victoria, Forest Fire Regions, from DELP, etc., just volunteers talking about how they'd planned for asset protection so the community could recover post the fire. So they look after the Buchan Caves as an economic tourist asset. They look after the police station, the various things that they make sure in their town planning they have protected so that they can go forward once the fire passes and rebuild their economies and their lives and their communities around these critical assets. And I think that increasingly we did see a big response to the biodiversity impact and the impact on threatened species and flora and fauna through the fires this year, which was unprecedented and just amazing response. And my great goal is that we'll start building our environmental asset planning and our ecosystem asset planning into our broader plan at the community level. And I think, I really do think this touches on what Michael's saying. How do we manage our country, and how do we listen to our traditional owners to manage country so that we're not going from this boom-bust arrangement?
So, Michael, I'll cross back to you. What would you like to see done differently as we tackle bushfires in future?
That's a good question. Gillian raised some really important initiatives, and I kept thinking in the back of my mind, they sort of resemble triage to me. They're kind of very reactionary. They're sort of planning for disaster. They're not getting on the front foot, I think. It's this sort of pattern of patch, respond, have the big Royal Commission, have all these investigations into what we can do better. Things change around the edges, and we just become better, maybe not, at protecting certain elements of the world around us, responding better. But I don't think we've made too many meaningful steps in long-term shifts in the way that we interact and engage and manage the world around us, our environments, the forest systems, for example. That we're not employing the right kind of management, which would be, if an Indigenous, where it's possible, Indigenous perspective would be intimate and reflective, on the ground, sensing, walking around. It requires a lot more investment of people power and resources, but it has more than just environmental effects. It has an effect of connecting people with country, which has all sorts of positive social and medical and health effects that re-engaging with country has on people, things that are called co-benefits, increased psychological health, increased well-being, increased physical health, all of these sorts of things that people have when they connect with the country around them and get involved in the long-term maintenance and sustenance of the world around us. And I think I'd like to see come out of this latest catastrophe, if you like, that hit Southeast Australia, which if the Royal Commission preliminary findings or indication, there's not really going to be too much of a massive shift, at least at the national level. I'd like to see some long-term implementation of traditional management of landscapes, and that means getting traditional owners back on country, managing the landscapes where they can. And I'd like to see something done about the way that private property, which, what do you say, Gillian, around 70% of the country's private property, or a huge estate, how we collectively manage catchments or large areas that exceed the individual boundaries of private property, and get some kind of system of management across there, which is going to require, forests on farms, all of these kinds of approaches that stop this idea that you can own a little patch and then it's independent from everything else. So I think that some long-term plans around meaningful changes in the way that we engage with and manage our landscape from now right through the next big bushfires that come through, continually through time. And that way we can sort of dampen the extremities, the extreme impact of some of these big events that are going to come through. We're going to have these climate-driven situations where catastrophic fires are almost inevitable, if current climate change continues. But by applying a continual process across the landscape throughout time, you can dampen down the extremity of those and sort of push out the curve, if you like. And that way we can mitigate against some of the really extreme effects and not have to be so dependent on this triage reactive response. I just want to rather see us get more proactive and use the tools around us.
Thank you. Gillian, did you want to add something there?
I just agree. I just wanted to add to Michael's comment to look at, if we go back to the original question, which you said about the top-down versus bottom-up, and there's so much going on the ground. I just suggest to Michael and others to look to the Victorian government's policy in these areas, because there is a lot of work going on in Victoria around traditional burns and also environmental water, traditional owner involvement. It's not tokenistic. It is fully integrated into policy in Victoria.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think Victoria's, well ahead of many other states. I think one thing that's amazing. One thing that we noticed and was really obvious in the recent tragedy was that there needs to also be a national approach. I think these sort of artificial state boundaries that prevent effective management, information flow, whatever it is that allow us to sort of do things better. But yeah, I agree, Gillian. We're doing a really good job here in Victoria.
So Jennifer, if I may just add another comment here, because that's a very important element that just raised.
Yep.
Is that I think when disaster actually displays people, and land records actually are the key to protecting property rights and also livelihood. I think enabling people to return to their homes and also farms, businesses, or livelihood is essential for resilience recovery. What Gillian just has said, and also Mark has indicated, a system will fail if it is not capable of delivering accurate information in real time during a disaster event. Therefore, the ability of the land and also people-to-land relationships to cover after hazard actually events requires a reliable administration system and authoritative information in that.
Thank you, Abbas. Now, Mark, let's talk about disaster fatigue. Given the increasing frequency and intensity of disasters, how does that challenge how we prepare and respond?
It's a really good question, Jennifer. And to pick up on Michael's comments particularly, I think we have to accept inevitability of these events, not as disasters, but as events. They're the expression of the force of nature. They've been with us forever. They'll be with us forever. So I think inevitability is an interesting concept. It doesn't have to be disastrous, but again, to Michael's point, if we take a long-term view, take the most intense aspects of these events, off our radar by changing the way we manage the land, the way we shape our values, the way we build our societies, we can absorb, adapt, transform, and cope with these effects as they turn up. So I think we've got to stop resisting them. I think we've got to see them in a much longer term proposition. I do think the psychology of these is that we continue to fear them, and we should fear them when they're harmful. But if we can build societies that can accommodate them, then the harm starts to lessen. The fear of harm starts to lessen. I think they'll become, for want of a better word, more tolerable, because they're not going to go away. The events are not going to disappear. As much as we might want them to, I don't think they are. So. But look, I think fundamentally, and it's concerned me for quite some time now, is that there's enormous burden placed upon the citizen or the community to be resilient, but we haven't really inquired into what the causation of the disaster is, and it is that where and how we place ourselves upon the landscape and the societies in which we build, and the institutional responsibilities in this space are ambiguous and difficult to nail or difficult to attribute. Yet the community responsibility and citizen responsibility is pretty much promoted, abundantly clear what we want them to do. But when you look in the institutional side of things, the top-down approach, it's much more cloudy. And to Michael's point, for example, about interjurisdictional complexity, that's one great example where sovereignty takes precedence over national interest or other interests. It's just one example, and it happens between agencies, it even happens between people. I mean, the notion of self-interest scaled up or scaled down is always problematic. But so I think if we want to take the fatigue out of the system, I think we have to accept their inevitability, position for them in such a way that we're not so distressed about it, and we can accommodate the forces into our societies and the way in which we live. So it's a long-term proposition. It concerned me last summer when government said, and this was the discourse that was being promoted by most governments, and I think it was true that there's nothing more that they could do. Expect death, expect property loss, abandon localities, follow instructions. These were messages coming from governments, but really we've got to ask ourselves the question: is that where we want to get to? If that's all our government has to offer, to abandon localities, expect death and destruction and whatever, then we have a real problem. We have a big problem in terms of how we're going to navigate this going forward, because what we've experienced is not a new normal, it's the start of a trajectory. And that trajectory is pretty steep unless we do some fairly significant decarbonising of the economy and reducing heat out of the climate system. Then we're going to have to expect more of these, more intense and more frequent, and we've heard plenty about that. And I think the last point I'd say, Jennifer, is that we hear the term unprecedented a lot, and I think there's a statistical reality to that. But unprecedented should not mean surprising, and unprecedented should not mean absence of accountability, because we have foreshadowed and forecast these intense events for 20 or 30 years in our science. The extent to which we position for them is variable. Some aspects of institutions and society have prepared well, but others have not. But to use unprecedented as an excuse for not being ready for something, I find difficult to rationalise. And when you look at the inquiries, and to Michael's point, when you look at the inquiries and what they discover institutional lapses, and they discover institutional gaps, an absence of consideration and deficient knowledge, to Abbas's point. It's actually nothing to do with the fire. It's to do with institutional life. It's to do with the built environment and society. It's not actually about the fire. All the fire really does, or the flood or the cyclone, is shows us where the vulnerability already is. It simply puts a magnifying glass over society and says, have a look, here's where you've got a problem. So I think we've got to turn it around and say, how do we better absorb, accommodate and transform from these forces, rather than simply fighting them all the time, seeing them as a short-term proposition, or lapsing our concentration in between events, because they're going to keep coming. They're part of the natural cycle from here.
Mark, you mentioned preparation. What are some of the most important policy and framework reforms that are required to ensure a more sustainable future?
I think I was head of the Resilience Task Force for the federal government for a couple of years, and before that, Director General of VMA for about 6. And when I took over the task force, it was called the Resilience Task Force, National Resilience Task Force. And I said to the government, the first place we need to go is risk reduction. And they said, what is that? And I said, because if you don't get harm out of the system, it's not possible to be resilient. Resilience is not an endless capability. It's not an endless thing that we just have lots and lots of. It's limited by many things, time and place, spatially and temporally, and the circumstances of our life is part of it. But if we don't get control of harm production through the decisions that we're making in our societies, then we get to a threshold point where resilience is simply not possible. So I think that part of the preparation is to really have a critical look at risk. Who's producing it? What decisions are being made that are producing that on the landscape? To what extent are human values, ecological, social and other values being taken into account in that decision-making process? And where do our vulnerabilities exist in society that we can do something about structurally, economically and socially? And so these are big questions. If we deal around the edges of having the citizen protect their house by cleaning out their gutters and mowing their lawns, that's great. That helps. But if you look at the scale and the complexity of the fires of southeastern Australia last summer, none of that preparation made any bit of difference whatsoever. We had a landscape that was so volatile that unless it was made out of steel, brick, concrete or masonry, it was going to burn, and it did. And it did spectacularly, and that's what we need to accommodate. That's the sort of scale of thinking we need to lift to if we're going to get ready for these things into the future.
Thank you. Now back to you, Abbas. The bushfires are the consequence of the bigger threat of climate change, and this requires a global effort and international cooperation to deal with it. How can organisations such as the UN help to enforce the idea of this kind of cooperation?
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. This is an excellent question. I think the one that the United Nations has started working on it is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which has 17 goals into this. And also these goals have been a good driver for climate actions, and also with the initial cooperation in this area is emerging. And this is the one that lasts about 5 years. Now, UN, in interaction with all member states, started developing some strategic pathways to adopting this and having a harmonized type actions and also guidelines. And however, the progress is relatively slow when we look at some of the indicators here. To help enforce the idea of such cooperation is a huge challenge to be undertaken by the UN and any countries. But many governments also hesitate or under pressure from the industries, or to keep the status quo and also not implement the change to address the climate change, for example. I think the education and also climate change is a way to help enforce cooperation, as there also is still a lack of understanding of what sort of climate change is and what the impacts are. And also will be and how we can really make a difference here. So I think these are the elements. And with the COVID, with the situation that we are all in, the change is fresh in our minds. And I think this is an area, and this is also time. We have a good opportunity here to show the change can happen. And also it must, and we can also all adopt and alert and also alter our behavior, or to ensure that we have a future here for the planet. And I think this is what we can learn from the current and also adopting the international type frameworks here. But at the same time, what Gillian also has indicated, I think this is another element that from the top-down and bottom-up approach. This is a two ways that we have to work, and bringing that and localizing those kind of guidelines and frameworks that we can do this. And this is what UN is started and working. And in compared to the last 10 years, we can see more progress here because of the alignments, and also countries started adopting those kind of framework.
So what can you tell us, Abbas, about what the University of Melbourne is doing to lead research and teaching to ensure that the next generation is able to be effective global leaders in sustainability?
University of Melbourne has a very clear strategy to addressing the sustainability and contributing into this from different areas, by also putting the programs such as the fellowships for the integrating the sustainability into the curriculum, into the major subjects, as well as also developing programs to train the leaders as well as also future practitioners, the students, into these areas. We have already started working in a number of areas, and also university put also very clear strategic plan for the sustainability to doing that. We also started expanding our research across the different areas because of the number of areas of the goals and indicators, and also developing the environment that we can better demonstrating our contribution to sustainability. In fact, we have also opportunity like the Fisherman's Bend becoming as one of the area that to be live testbed for measuring and monitoring the sustainability, and also forecasting the areas, and also providing such a platform to assisting at the international level, as well as also contributing to our backyard, to our, the jurisdiction here, but also communicating and interacting and measuring and also comparing different elements. One of the areas that is missing, and the countries are started actually to thinking about this, is about the type of dashboard that would assist in a better way of interrelationship between the indicators and also the goals, and also the impacts of each of those on each other. There is something that we need to really understand. If we want to work on one particular goal, we need to understand the impact of this onto the others. We cannot just apply something here and may actually also providing negative impact on the other areas. So therefore, by understanding and visualizing this, I think that would actually work. So university is very committed to this, and also I'm very pleased to also seeing that university has also signed a letter also supporting and also encouraging federal governments for adaptation of SDGs framework as a potential framework to developing the economic recovery plan, for example.
Okay, now a question from our audience. And this is for you, Abbas, what are the pitfalls in attempting to transition and integrating with legacy infrastructure and systems?
I think there are a number of things can actually be expected here. One is the perhaps inefficiency as we try to adopt and merge the infrastructure and system together. Perhaps that is the part that we need to also measure and test this, and also improve the outcome here, as well as also perhaps perception and also resistance from people, or from the people actually, or from the group that dealing with this. And another area would be perhaps security issues or privacy, as well as also potential breaches. I think these are the potential immediate elements that can come over, and we need to look at and try to respond and overcome.
Thank you. Now, Michael, we've talked about integration of Indigenous perspectives and land management practices. There's a few questions coming in from our audience about how we can do this better. What else would you like to see being done in terms of sustainability strategies?
It's a good question. I think thinking nationally, there's really strong Caring for Country program, which funds Indigenous-led and Indigenous-owned ranger programs, in which Indigenous people are doing natural resource management. One of those is very strong in the top end of the country, say with the carbon farming, the savanna burning initiatives, which use targeted traditional burning to offset carbon release. Whilst there's a bias towards the north, there's a lot of strong ranger programs, and Gillian sort of mentioned, say, the Judja Wurrung in Victoria are really strong and advanced in this area of managing landscapes. I'd like to see more, speaking to that top-down, bottom-up, more of a national architecture or more availability of the current architecture for regional traditional owner groups, okay, because cultural burning or traditional management is embedded in place and the knowledge that's developed in place. For those groups to connect to the national architecture, the Caring for Country scheme, so that they can engage with and reinvigorate and reactivate their management systems in landscapes. That's something that I'd like to see as a broad approach. I'd like to see, touching on Mark's point and Abbas's point of education, I would like to see embedded in the national curricula some meaningful education about Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous practice, Indigenous peoples. You know, the frightful experience of asking my kids' primary school what Indigenous content they had in their school, and they said, I think we cover it in the Gold Rush section of history. You know, it's like, I nearly fell off my chair, you know, that there's not, and there's idiosyncratic examples. There's schools that do it really strongly, but there needs to be a coordinated national emphasis on this from primary right through to tertiary. And we have, to add to Abbas's comment about what the university's doing, we've got the newly formed Indigenous Knowledges Institute, which have one of the pillars that we're focused on in that institute is curriculum. And we've already developed a really substantive source for secondary schools to embed Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous practice, Indigenous science, art, the works into curricula. We're embedding curricula across the tertiary sector, and we're doing research in the space to both advance Indigenous knowledge, connect with community organisations, embed that in the tertiary system, but also flow that through to curricula. So I think there's a whole lot of areas in which we need to work on. I think the underlying message there is that hopefully, you know, modern Australia stopped battling and fighting with the landscape that it lives in, that we start to connect. And we see that if it's through the prism of Indigenous knowledge, then let's go for it, you know, like, because there's a perfect nexus right there. But modern Australia needs to connect and needs to understand it and embrace the land we live in. Not try and turn it into a mini Europe, not try and do all these sorts of things, not try and do irresponsible things that cause problems down the line. Understand, respect, and engage with the country that we have and love it.
There's been great interest in books such as Dark Emu and Sand Talk, and those authors argue that we not only need to adopt Indigenous practices, but also embrace Indigenous thought processes and knowledge systems, and that Indigenous people need to be involved in the process in order for it to be effective. So, Michael, how far back do we need to strip the way we approach issues of sustainability in order to more comprehensively adopt Indigenous land management practices across Australia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we have this tendency in this sort of technocratic society that we live in of trying to poach ideas and shove them into the mechanics and pull the levers that way. Whereas what we're talking about here is a cultural practice. You know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't see the land as something separate. They see it as part of themselves. The practice of managing landscape and country is a practice of managing yourself and the country. It's a cultural practice, which in order to effectively institute or apply needs to come from the cultural lens. So it needs to be Indigenous-led, if not Indigenous-owned, and Indigenous people doing the work. You can't sort of just pull it out and apply it in a kind of Band-Aid kind of way. It actually needs to be set from the inception of the idea right through the practice. It needs to come from the culture from which it's born. So, and there's a lot of benefits there. I think, as I said, it's a way that modern Australia can connect to country, and this becomes then a part of the Australian cultural norm, rather than this exotic Indigenous way of doing things. I think we can really use it as a vehicle to connect, but it needs to be conducted and led and advised by Indigenous people for it to be a true reflection of what the practice is.
Okay, so we have an interesting question from the Q&A that I'll address to Michael first, but then I'll get the others to chip in with your opinion. At this point, is it too late to take action to prevent the effects of climate change on our society? Is it time to switch to a reactive resilience approach or adaptability rather than prevention? So starting with Michael.
All of the above, I think. Like we're heading down a road, and that we're on that path. It doesn't mean you ignore how the car's travelling and the way that you handle the car on the road. Let's institute changes that are going to propagate influences down the road. And as we talked about before, bring down the severity of those extreme things when they occur, those climate-driven wildfires and these other big problems that we're going to get, these catastrophic water deficits, these droughts. Bring down the impact of those by doing some preventative or some from proactive work at the start, but also work on, okay, when they arrive, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to manage this? And that involves the psychology and everything that Mark was talking about. It involves all of the processes and things that Gillian was talking about in terms of what the government's doing around assets and all this sort of stuff. It requires all of that adaptation. It requires mitigation, but it also requires the trying to do prevention now and changing what we're doing now. I think you can't just throw your hands up and say, oh, well, because this thing's not going to just get to that point of it's bad and stay there, It's going to continue to go and go and go and go. So we've got to do the front end work now, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, do you have anything to add?
Look, I think I agree with Michael. Adaptation, absolutely. Mitigation, absolutely. And the third pillar now that's emerging in the climate policy space is loss and damage. And I think we've got to come to terms with the fact we are going to lose things. So the tipping point is very close. The climate is already manifesting in greater intensities and frequencies of events. And we're seeing that in its physicality now. It's no longer a theory. So we really have to start to anticipate what we call our history. What is it that's valuable? Within what's valuable, what's tradable, and what's not tradable, and work through the complexity of that through participative democracy and other processes to really position ourselves for what is going to be a very difficult period for humanity. So the question, the person asking the question is right. This thing is on its way. I think we've all said that today. So we're going to lose things. What is it we're prepared to lose? What is it we're not prepared to lose? And that will reshape policy, and that will reshape value. And hopefully, to Gillian's point earlier, it'll reshape politics if we get it right. And we need to do that because we just can't keep holding the same set of values, thinking it's all going to go away, or we're going to be able to withstand these forces if we don't make those fundamental shifts.
Thank you. Gillian, final thoughts?
Well, final thoughts are for someone whose job it is as Commissioner to provide data that helps decision making, so report on science. And I think at the end of the day, I agree with what the other speakers have said. And I do think we need to be able to translate data into an accessible form for decision makers so they can understand the multiple aspects of any given decision, social, economic and environmental. And that's something that talks about the system and the systemic impact, not just the impact on biodiversity, water, housing, etc. And that's why I think the SDGs are so important, and that's why we're implementing them in our work. Leaders are rewarded for making evidence-based decision-making, and even as a community, we've shown a great interest in even in Melbourne, the Premier's briefings every day on what the data's telling us. So how do we create, and for us, it's how do we use the SDGs to help us create a more systemic view of what the consequence of any decision is in regard to its impact on the environment as well as communities, not just the economy. And biodiversity is top of the list, really. I just want to say from the 2018 State of the Environment report for Victoria, one of the only independent State of the Environment reports in the country besides the ACT, by the way, 3/4 of the indicators were of 35 indicators were either in decline or of unknown status. And there's a huge investment now in science to start to understand more about how we make sure we're incorporating decisions around biodiversity into our resilience planning.
Thank you. And Abbas, in our final minute of the webinar Q&A, what are your thoughts? Is it too late to take action?
No, I think there is a big opportunity now that we have because of this pandemic, and also people, while they have this fresh of the change in mind, and I think that is the one that we should take it action and apply and change our behaviors. In fact, we are living with this situation. This is not something that is going to be away, as Mark has indicated. So we have to find and change our way of operation and also our way of running different things. So therefore, it is a time for us, and we have to take action and also applying some of the lessons that we have learned and sustaining that one for the future, from the economic perspective, from the behavioral perspective, and also from our future design and development of any type of elements. We need to incorporate the resilience into our design in a way that we can then mitigate this as well. So becoming more resilient and also adopting with that, as we already actually learning very fast here.
Thank you. On behalf of the University of Melbourne, thank you to all of our panellists for your contribution to this discussion. And also thank you to our audience for your questions and interest in this fascinating topic. There were many questions submitted, so I hope that yours was approached by theme, if not literally. And special thanks to Zara for the live graphic recording of today's discussion. We welcome your feedback through our post-event survey, which is displayed in the comments on the screen and will appear on the screen after this session. Thank you very much and goodbye.